Pretty sure you should see the countdown too.
I see it, yep.
Okay, good. Cool. To the Curious Cult Show, I am sitting with Natalie Nagele. I got that right, Nagele?
You did, yes.
Awesome. Welcome. Thank you so much for giving me your time.
Thank you, Nick. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. So, like on every one of my episodes, I tend to not introduce my guests, and my listeners are used to that. So, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to my audience, and then we will dive right into talking about starting stuff.
Awesome. Yeah. So I am Natalie Nagele. I am one half of a team. I run the business, my company Wildbit, with my husband, actually. So I call it like a mom and pop shop. And Wildbit just turned 20, October 25th. So we've been doing this for an insanely long time. And, you know, I just I live in Philadelphia, but the team's fully remote and has been since day one. I have two little girls that we get to keep us very busy. But yeah, just really excited. Wildbit's a company that really believes that businesses are designed to support human beings, and that's kind of our mission and our reason for existing.
Amazing. 20 years is quite a thing. Interestingly, I am 36 now, and I started my first business 20 years ago when I was 16. So, I mean, I have to ask, how old were you when you started Wildbit that it's 20 years old now?
So I am 34. Chris, my husband, started it when he was 20, and we've been together for 17 years.
Wow.
So he started it, yeah. So he started, technically he was like 19, but the official incorporation documents that I found are October 25th, 2000. So that's the date that we kind of, you know, the stamp's on there.
Wow.
But yeah, so I didn't start Wildbit. He started Wildbit as a consulting company, doing kind of brochure nightclub websites. And then we met my senior year of high school. He's 6 years older than me. And so we met my senior year of high school, and then kind of that was it. And have been doing this my entire adult life. Yeah.
That is just crazy. What a cool story. So the focus of the podcast is on starting stuff, and it's definitely something that Wildbit is good at, knows how to do, and has a very clear idea of what you want to start. So I suppose now that I know your history a little bit, the questions have this very interesting perspective on them. So the first question is usually, can you remember the first really difficult thing that you started? And genuinely, this could be anything. For me, I started writing at a really young age, and I found it really interesting but challenging at like 7 or 8 years old. So can you remember anything that really was difficult that you started?
So it's funny because I have this real block in my mind for a lot of my childhood, which is very strange. And there's like these different moments, but I'm actually, I'm an immigrant. I came to the US as a refugee in 1989 with my parents, and just had a very kind of different childhood, you know, much more grown up of a childhood, because I had a little sister that was born here right after we moved, and my parents were working really hard. And so I did a lot of, you know, raising my sister and taking care of the home and doing things that were there was a lot more responsibility at a young age, which I think set up kind of my ability to be able to do this so young, because I kind of just did things a lot sooner. But I guess, you know, I think in a lot of ways, it's difficult for me to reflect on something that was difficult, because I don't think I had a lot of space mentally to like process that this is hard. It was just kind of just pushing through. And I think when your parents are immigrants like that too, there's less of an ability to stop and pause and reflect and say, this is hard. But maybe what really, where I have clarity on that feeling of, oh my God, this is going to be hard and I'm going to have to push through it and really set my mind to it, is actually much more recent, maybe like 8-ish years ago, where, you know, Chris and I have been working on this business for so long, and it was always the two of us, and it was very scrappy for a very long time. And, you know, I had this, we did everything together. We didn't really have titles or even a clear delineation between our roles as partners, business partners. And so we went through this kind of, with an advisor, went through this whole process of reflecting on what our skills are, what we want our job to be, realizing it's very silly that we make every decision together, that we're in every meeting together. This just isn't good. And in that discovery, identified that my role should be CEO. And, I think there's a lot of emotional things that came with it. I used to joke all the time it was more like couples counseling than partners counseling, because, up until that point, I had always reflected, this is Chris's business. I work for Chris's business, even though he made a very specific point to draft incorporation documents early on to say, no, it's 50-50 Chris and Natalie, but I just still, it was Chris's business. And so when we got to this point where Natalie is CEO, I clearly remember actually a moment. I was going for a run. I used to run late at night, after the kids were in bed and all of that. And I remember going for a run. It was hot in the summer. And I was like, if I'm taking this on, I got to do the work. What does that even mean? And just that real clear moment of oh, I have a job. Because we had this entrepreneurial journey that things just kind of happened. There wasn't a lot of intentionality behind it. And it was, just a lot of reacting and reflecting on things, but not this clear purpose. And at that point, I know that I was very cognizant that I had a job and a clear path and a role to fit into, and I didn't know anything about it and what that meant. And that, I think, was just this really difficult starting point, but a beautiful one. I mean, that also is when I found the most happiness, in my work, was having that clear delineation of this is what I do, I have responsibilities that rely on me. I don't have to go back and forth and ask somebody else. It was really important.
That's so interesting. And I mean, usually this comes up much deeper into a conversation, but how on earth did you cope with the imposter syndrome that wrapped around this, holy shit, I'm going to be the CEO. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Where do I go from here?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, because it never really goes away. And I was actually having a conversation with somebody, and they're like, imposter syndrome sounds really weird. Isn't it just this, constant self-doubt as individuals who want to continue to be better? And maybe there's some truth to that. But I think I had to really work in understanding that while it's a title that's well regarded and well understood, the actual role varies dramatically from company to company. And I think it was a journey of, what does Wildbit need from a CEO, right? What is that role between Chris and Natalie as co-founders, right? Because on an org chart, Chris doesn't report to me, obviously, right? We're co-founders, we're together. It's just I run the business, the front of the house side of things, the public-facing part of things, marketing, and he runs the product side of things, right? Playing really to our strengths. And it took a really long time to lean into that confidence of things that I say, they're right, or they deserve the space, right? That was probably the hardest part, because when I thought of CEO, I was oh, I have to be this brilliant, all-knowing, all-experienced person, and then realize that no, actually, it's my experience, and you do the best you can, and you do it in a way that serves your team and your business and your customers, right? What's core to you. And that was really helpful. But I also spent a lot of time at that point. We also spent a lot of time finding other founders and building a really strong network of founders. And that really helped. I used to laugh. Before we had this circle for over half the life of the business, we never really had a network. We've always felt that was stupid. Networking is for, people who wear suits. And so when that flipped and we actually started spending a lot of time with founders, realized that on the outside, it looks like every business is doing so well. And then when you get inside, you realize we're all just dumpster fires. And so I think that was when a lot of my confidence was building, when I was oh no, it's all shit everywhere. Everywhere. And I mean that very sincerely.
Nobody has a clue.
No, none of us know what the hell we're doing. And it was funny then. It's still funny now, but it's so obvious now, because a business is just a collection of human beings, and because no human beings are the same, no business could ever be the same. And so you could be the most successful CEO ever, and then go to a new company and be oh shit, what do I do now, right? Because you could bring with yourself experiences, but nothing is ever going to apply apples to apples, because again, they're all human beings with their own personalities, and it's just never going to be repeatable. And so I think that really helped, having a network to bounce off of ideas off of, to just kind of talk things through and say, am I crazy? Am I getting this right? You know, especially hard for me was leaning into my instinct and finding the balance between, you know, I know this is right in my heart and in my gut, but I probably want to, you know, check this against some things versus no, this is a decision I can make based on my heart and my gut, and it's going to be okay. And so like finding that balance too is really tough. I'm a very kind of like emotional person, and so I react very emotionally. And so, you know, like it's my superpower, but it can also be a crutch if I don't kind of react really intentionally with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. The first thing on not knowing what the hell you're doing, I like to tell people that most of the time I live on the forefront of incompetence, not knowing anything about what I'm doing, but I like to learn. And that ties back to the imposter syndrome. Another way I've heard it phrased, and the way that I prefer, is imposter phenomenon, because it's a phenomenon that pushes you to learn more. That when you feel like you don't know what you're doing and you feel like a fake and a fraud, most people buckle and some people learn more. And I prefer the phenomenon idea, that it makes us these interesting, ambitious, kind of driven people. But the question that I have is, the network thing is so interesting to me, that you didn't have one, and then all of a sudden you were like, holy crap, we need this. What was the moment that you guys were like, okay, actually, we need other people? Like, why did you flip?
We have never raised money, and one of the things that we had always talked about, because we would get inbound interest from, you know, venture capitalists and things like that, and we always kind of had this step in the process where Chris and I would take a piece of paper and write down individually, like, if I gave you $1 million in cash, how would you spend it? And then we'd kind of bring it back together and say, you know, we'd each like come up with like 200 grand worth of stuff, and we're like, well, I can get a bank loan for that, right? I'm not going to give up. And that was like a consistent, we do like a couple times a year, every year, you know. It's just like a good exercise to say, what would we do that would make that 1 million turn into 10, right? Otherwise, what's the point of giving away equity? But in that process, the thing that we always felt like we missed with not raising money was not having connections, this ability to you know, call somebody up and be like, I need this great client. Or, hey, you have somebody in your portfolio. How do they do this thing? Can you help? And the time when it became really apparent to us was when we launched Postmark. We had been kind of talking about that product for a long time, and Chris had been pushing me like, I want to build it, I want to build it. And I'm like, no, we have no time for this. Like, we have too many products. And he's like, no, we should just. So one day he's like, I'm just going to build it. It'd be really fast. I said, fine, go. And so he built it, but right as we were building it, a big competitor launched. But they had the backing of huge venture capitalists. And like within launching immediately, they had all these incredibly big clients, and we're sending all these emails, and we were like, how did that happen? And then realized like, oh, because they're all in their portfolio, and immediately they launched, and it was like, here's, you know, now you send through, you know, this competitor. So we were like, okay, we're clearly onto something. And we had gone to a conference, Business of Software, which is my favorite business conference. And we intentionally got together with a few folks kind of in our industry, around our industry, people we knew. And we had this great dinner with some founders, and realized how much we were making decisions in a vacuum that could have been really helped by other people. And it was like that dinner when we came home, and I was like, oh, we need way more of this in our lives, because you got to talk about things that just we aren't writing on the internet, right? Like, we're just not sharing. And it, you know, we had been walking this path in, you know, inspired by a lot of companies that were doing it a certain way, but you only had access to what they were sharing out in the open. And so, you know, we would take these steps forward thinking we're kind of making the right choices, but not realizing there's so much more underneath. And when we had that dinner and we were talking about like really nuanced, I mean, business is about like 30 details a day, right? It's not like just these big ones. It's a lot of these micro details that, you know, micro decisions that we're making that ultimately steer the ship in the right direction. And so we had this dinner and had these conversations about, you know, people issues and culture and product and you know, engineering, and like that fire and this fire, you know. And we walked away feeling like, oh, we're not alone, and oh, other people have these problems, and or these successes and these wins, and we should really talk to each other. And so we ended up creating like a founders group. Then we like went away a couple times, and then Chris and I continued to build, you know, other networks around, going to Business of Software and a few other conferences, and just meeting people on the internet. And just really, that was a huge moment for us to transform, because we had other people who were usually, I like to think like I want some folks who are a little bit ahead of me, not like so far ahead that it's just radically unattainable, but a little bit far ahead, so they've kind of done some things. And then I want to have people who are a little bit behind because they're going to tell me things that I'm not thinking about, and then people on the same level. So just kind of having this like really beautiful system where there's a reciprocal relationship. It's not just me feeding off of these folks, but really gave me a lot of perspective and some key messages and key directions that totally changed our course, and all in a matter of like a couple conversations.
Wow, incredible. I mean, it's true. Having someone, I read somewhere, someone to learn from, someone to practice with, and someone to teach is such a great way to become an expert at anything. It does bring me to another question, which I've struggled with for most of my career as an entrepreneur, is I don't have mentors, and I've never had mentors. They just never arrived in my world. I don't know why, they just never did. So has this founders group kind of replaced that for you, or did you and your husband also have mentors to help you through stuff?
We have had certain people in our lives, like unofficial kind of mentors along the way. I've never also had a very structured mentor. I've never had a board, which I think about a lot, like having a non-legally binding board, but like a board of directors that can help me, board of advisors that can help kind of ask good questions. But we've had mentors along the way. Chris's father has always worked in corporate. He was the president of the Art Institute. He worked for businesses and operations roles and all kinds of stuff. And he's just somebody I really care and trust. Very well-read business guy from North Philly. And so, he's always been a mentor to us, where he would ask us questions like, well, how are you going to sell that? I'm like, what are you talking about? It just sells itself. And he's like, no, that's not how it actually works. And so it was just wonderful because he would apply these more traditional business philosophies or practices to us, and where we are being fed mostly, in the software world, a pretty strict denial or resistance towards how business was always done, right? And so he would always be this kind of like other voice in our heads that would remind us that there's like certain things that are still the same. This is still people, it's still business, you got to sell value, like all these things. And then I don't think that the founders were really like mentors to us. I think really it was much more a collaborative kind of more like bouncing ideas, commiserating together. Not really a mentorship program, but when you said that, what made me think is I'm very resistant to people telling me what to do. And I've always struggled with mentorship because I don't want somebody to come in and tell me that I'm wrong, even though it's probably really good. I have a real resistance, like a visceral resistance to somebody being like, that's a bad decision. I'm like, I want to find out that it's a bad decision because it's just not good. I'm not recommending that, but that's just who I am as a person. It's one of those things I fight against. And I've thought of it whenever somebody's like, you should get a board. I'm like, I think that's right, but like, are you going to tell me that I'm wrong? Because I don't know. I didn't do this. I'm not doing this, so somebody else tells me what to do. Like, it's one of my.
I mean, I can't listen to that and not ask you about how you and your husband have lasted for 20 years in business, never mind as partners. I mean, all jokes aside, it's a relatively inefficient way to be CEO, is to have people to be really like struggle with being told you're wrong. So how do you actually cope with it? Because you obviously do a very good job at dealing with it. How do you take on that kind of criticism?
From him in particular, or just in general?
No, I mean, from him, yes, but in general, I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've gotten much better at it. And I think what I've come to realize is I need to keep a circle of folks around me who I trust and who I respect. And so when they speak, my natural inclination is to listen. And the way, there's very few of those folks in my life because of how, again, like so much of this is personal, right? You got to know me as a person too before you give me advice. And if you're going to give me advice that's strictly on a financial model business thing that like, well, you have to do X to create Y, like it's never going to work. It's just not the way I run the business, right? There's just so much more personal human parts to it for me. But in particular, Chris is the only person in the world who will always tell me the truth, no matter what. And he's the person that I rely on the most to call me on my bullshit. And there's plenty of that. And so, that's an important piece of it. And I think just creating space, and I rely on it, right? Because I got plenty of bullshit, so like I need somebody to be like, what do you like? Stop. You've lost it. Stop it. And I think I've really asked my team to call me on it too. And so I've tried to really approach things with a curiosity. So if somebody does disagree or question things, I try to be curious about it. And I've really learned and spent a lot of time. It's a practice. I'm not great at it, but I've learned to contain my reactions, my initial immediate reactions, and give myself space to process. And so if somebody comes and says, like, I highly disagree with that decision that you make, I will probably have a face, but I will pause and I will say, okay, I need to process that a little bit. But again, it also probably depends on how large those decisions are. Even Chris's father will have lots of deep conversations. And, there's a philosophical way in which we run Wildbit that is counter to the way that he ran, manufacturing businesses or for-profit schools, right? There's just this, and he understands where we're coming from, but it's just not his experience. So when we get to this point of, it's not the way you do things, that is where I immediately turn off, because I'm like, well, there is no way you do things. It's the way that you do things, right? There's no rule. These aren't businesses aren't natural things that exist in the world, right? We've created them. They're human designed tools, right? So we can use them and do with them what we wish. And so I think those kind of things are harder for me to really like absorb feedback versus very operational things. I'm much more open to feedback and to respond to folks saying, like, I would do it this way or that way. Although I think one thing that I try to do when I mentor folks or other founders, and when people reach out and say, will you mentor me? My response is always, I will never give advice. Like, I think that's one of these things that I learned in a group that I was part of, where entrepreneurs just naturally stink at like receiving advice. Like, it just feels wrong. And in most cases, that advice isn't good anyway, because no question or no decision is that simple that I can talk to you for 30 minutes and you could say, do this, right? Because there's probably 6 hours worth of other things that I haven't told you about or I haven't even thought about. But what's extremely valuable is sharing experiences. And so I'm much more prone to be a mentor to you if you're okay with me just coming and asking you questions and sharing experiences. Because truthfully, like, again, we're all just individuals. We're all individual people. And so how we feel, what's important to us, our value set, right? The things that like really just drive us as people are going to have the strongest influence. But I could tell you a story about an experience or a situation or something I've seen happen that may not give you the answer, but hopefully will trigger something in your thinking that will help you make a better decision. And so I rely very heavily on that from people who I reach out to for advice. I'm not like, what would you do? Like, how did you do this? Or have you ever done this? And I want to hear their stories and then ask a lot of questions. Why'd you go that way, right? Why'd you make a decision like this? Why didn't you do this? And that, I think, helps me frame my problem a little bit better. And it gives me more alternatives that then I can start framing my solution that fits more like my value system and what I believe to be best for Wildbit.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that you are a curious person, and that's brilliant, because I wanted to ask you how you nurture that curiosity, because genuinely I believe that it is a muscle that some people exercise and others don't. Some people just accept what's presented to them, whereas others poke holes in every single possible thing that comes towards them. So what do you do to continue this kind of curious approach to the world? If there is anything specific?
I think I have this this tendency very much to question most things in the world. Partially because I just don't want to take other people's word for it. And I think if it doesn't clearly, like, if I can't clearly see all sides to an argument, I just have a lot of questions around that, that argument or that perspective. I'm curious about I'm curious about things like how people organize, how the world works, right? I'm not like curious about how a car is made. I think like where Chris and I are such funny opposites, like he's extremely interested, he's got like a more engineering mind, right? He's interested in how things work and how things are built. And I'm interested in like the the key forces on democracy and how to like, how to make sure that doesn't go away. So I think I try to feed it, it comes and goes. I think what I've really realized, obviously I try to read as many books as I can. I've been really interested in attempting to find more space to write my thoughts down in my own words so that I can kind of make sure that I understand them better. And I think ultimately, though, I can only feed my curiosity if I have space. And so, these last 7 months have really showed me that I'm lacking the mental clarity to be effectively curious, where I just like, it's all superficial. It's all just a lot of gut reactions, reading a bunch of random things. And I'm trying to get back into really understanding, like, what am I curious about? Where am I spending my time? And what do I want to more deeply understand? So there's been moments where some of my happiest moments or most fulfilled moments at work have been where I've been able to like be curious about something and really dive into it, really just try to like understand it and give myself kind of some range and what the various pieces around it are. So for example, when Wildbit became, we were always flat and didn't really have like an operating system, and we decided like, we knew we needed to scale, and Chris and I needed to not be involved in every decision, and we need to kind of create space for ourselves. And so I spent like 2.5, 3 months really just diving deep into what does it mean to have an operating system? What are the different systems out there that exist? What do I need to reinvent? And what do I need to kind of just piggyback off of? That's been a huge learning. My friend Chris Savage from Wistia said something a few years ago that really rang a bell, where he said, realizing that you should be innovating on the things that make you special, and then just borrowing from the things that don't, was really important to me. So like when we dove in, yeah, so important, because we used to try to reinvent everything. And he's like, he had this moment, when they were kind of doing their transition to Wistia, and he said that was one of the big learnings for them. And I took that away to mean, okay, if I'm going to do this operating system and I need to create an organizational structure and all these things, where's my superpower? Like, what's Wildbit's superpower, and what can we just like just dive in, right? Just like take a book. So we ended up picking a system off the shelf, right? Like a system that was like well developed, that felt really good for us. And where we tweaked was in the things that were specific to Wildbit, the things that we innovate on, like having multiple products, having teams that can shift between products, right? Having like our culture and our values put into it. But the rest we just took off the shelf. And what's been beautiful about that is, I was able to kind of be curious about it. I got down into like, what are the things that I really care about? What's my why? Why is this an important project? And then diving into execution and tweaking along the way. I think where before I would have wanted to tweak the entire thing and invent a whole new system just for us. And like, what would be the point of that? Not what I'm doing. And so slowly we're tweaking it, and it's becoming more and more unique to us. But I'm at least doing it based on experience and not just based on theory and philosophy because I read, 30 books on it.
Yeah. So you mentioned the word that I love, and I've heard a lot of founders recently talk more about, some of them have said boredom to me, some of them have said spaces like you. What do you mean when you say space? Space to be curious, the space to think, because I think that it's easy, and excuse me saying this, but it's easy for people with established profitable businesses to say you need space. What about the founders who are flailing? Like, where do they find space? What does it even mean? And that is a really a great thing that you have space, but where do you find space?
I know. I have very strong opinions on that, because I think you're right. And I have seen a lot of founders that we all look up to. Actually did a very long debate with DHH on this. It is unfair, in my opinion, to pretend like early startup, early business life is a walk in the park and that there's so much space. There was no space in the early days, I assure you. But I think where I have regrets, where I could have found space and is less maybe in the actual, I have the luxury now where I can take days off and my team is doing everything, right? I'm not doing support and coding and trying to talk to the accountant and the lawyer and all of that. Like I have folks that help me with that. But where I could have still made space was to know what the goals were, like to just have more forward thinking. I think where we did a lot of thrashing in the early days was just kind of reacting to everything. And if you let it, right, we know that like our brains will just feel really productive just reacting to stuff. But that's not going to get you as far as you'd like. And so where Chris and I, even before the operating system started giving ourselves spaces around the holidays, we would take 2 days and just go and plan for the year. And it would be these, like, they're not these like big detailed plans, but enough to say, all right, where do we want to go? And we get real specific, because I'm a big fan of, founders sitting down and putting numbers on a piece of paper, like know how much money you want to make, know what you need to spend it on, what is your personal life goals, right? Like, put some numbers down on paper. But that was space, right? Like, everybody can find 2 days of space to sit down and just say, all right, why am I doing this? I think there's always needs to be a course correction for founders to stop and say, why am I doing this? Does that why match my previous why? Is it still worth it? Am I still happy? Do I have a path that I think will solve that why, right? Like, there's a lot of points throughout that process where I think we don't ask ourselves that question. And that's how we get to these, 4 years later, and you're like, I hate everything about this damn thing. Why did I start in the first place? Just take it from me. So, I wish we had done that earlier, like really done that earlier, where we stopped and said, hey, this is still a thing that we can control. Because that, I think, if we really, if I really think, like, what was our biggest weakness and what's our biggest strength right now, is the fact that we look at the business as a tool that is fully in my control. Now, markets can change, which is why we have multiple products, but again, that's in my control, right? But I can control what this thing does, because I can change it and maneuver it and look ahead in ways that, for me, make it more sustainable and longer lasting, right? But it's mine to control. And so having those moments to stop, I think, reminds us that we are in control of that, and that every decision is yours, and you can kind of make it along the way and adjust and tweak. And that's the space that even the busiest, earliest stage founders can absolutely find for themselves. It doesn't have to be a daily, 3-hour walk to think, but even just a weekend or a Saturday morning where you're like, okay, why am I doing this? Is it still the reason I wanted to do it when I started this thing? Do I have a path forward that's going to fulfill that why? And just continuing to, like, course correct for it, I think can make a huge difference.
Such great advice. And I think you're absolutely right. Even in early stage startups where everyone thinks they're different, they're not. There is always an evening or a weekend or something. And to be clear, I call this the sacrifice fallacy. If you don't have that time, you're sacrificing too much already. There's a problem. You think that you have to work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't, and it's going to break you, and you're not going to recover.
For sure. And you're not working on the right things, right? I think there's like reactionary work, and then there's deep work, right? And I remember those days, right? Like, I did support, I remember coming home on Friday night and, like, doing support after, like, having a bottle of wine at dinner and being like, I love you, customer. You are my favorite person on earth. Like, I have done that, right? I mean, we did it all ourselves, everything but the coding. Yeah. And I also know that I didn't have to do that. And I also know that I wasn't prioritizing those real moments of, like, what is my job? Why, or what am I what's going to have the greatest lift, right? What's going to have the greatest impact? And it's easy for me to say in hindsight, because now I have the space to realize it. And that's just a thing that I wish somebody had told me sooner, sure. Right? What is the goal? Remember, somebody asked us once, I think a friend of Chris's dad's was like, well, how big do you think you can make this thing? And Chris said, I don't know, maybe 60 grand MRR. Like we didn't even have a plan. We didn't have a direction to go in. And I was like, oh, 60 would be freaking amazing. Well, thank God we planned way further than that. But like it's like there were no plans, there was no journey. Yeah. It was very reactionary, and that's how you end up working 20 hours, but you're probably working on the wrong things. There's probably a better thing to work on.
Absolutely. So I want to shift towards talking about starting things. Very specifically, 2 questions to kick us off. When you guys start a new product, a new project, or anything around starting, do you consider the detail or the big picture first?
I'm all about the big picture. For me, it's
why?
Yeah, for me, I think my brain works better kind of at 30,000 feet. And I try to look at things in how they can fit into this puzzle of either my life personally, I mean, it's like a personal project, or at work, if we're thinking about a new product or a new direction, how does it fit into the puzzle piece of the bigger system? But I think I'm not that black and white though, because I love the details sometimes. And what I've learned about myself is the details help ground uncertainty for me. So I think like I start at the big picture, and then if I feel a little muddy, I'll sit down and I'll draw it out. And even if it's, I'm trying to think like of an example. We're in this stage right now where we've launched a lot of products over 20 years, and we've shut some down, we've sold some, and we're in this kind of the next 10-year journey. What the next iteration of Wildbit, our year 20 to 30 is all around this idea of what we're calling people first innovation, and it's how can we create products in a way that doesn't drain the system, right? But allows a lot of creativity, allows us to spread the risk, and allows us to create an environment for our team to, if there's folks who are really entrepreneurial and want to take on a project, they have space to do that, or if they're just looking for a new technology or something new to play in. And, from an impact perspective, we'd like to build some products or have some, kind of greater impact like we did with People First Jobs. So we're looking at all these things, but realizing what we've learned over the past 20 years is if we don't create a really structured system around it, we'll drown. We'll have too many products, too many directions to go in. Chris and I are only two people. If they all rely on Chris and Natalie to make, especially in the early days, strategic decisions, it's all going to kind of implode. How does the team move around? Who gets to work on a new product? Who doesn't get, there's just like all these things. And so we're really, really attempting to hone in on a process that works for a while, but that we can test and iterate on as we go on. So that's Chris's project. On a high level, I spent a lot of time thinking about what does that mean, right? Like, what does that mean for things like career development paths? What does that mean for hiring, and what does that mean from an operation? So do we create new LLCs? Do we, sell products? Like what, and thinking about that. So I'll create like a kind of a bigger picture in my head, but then I'll frequently sit down and then just start sketching, and I'll be like, okay, so let's create an example, and I'll get into a little bit of the details, and I'll try to do a little scenario planning because it helps me process that bigger picture. And I think the other kind of good example is I don't get into the finances very deeply, like into this, minutia. But there are frequent moments where I like to go in and like really comb it. And it's usually moments from like, I know things are good, but I'd like to just, and it just calms my mind, right? It creates more clarity for me in those small details. And then I go back and delegate back to my team because I really just want to be lazy and do nothing. So like, the more they can do, the better, the happier I am. So, and so you hire brilliant people who are doing it much better than you, but the details calm me. Like they just create a sense of control, I think, because high level doesn't really give me a lot of tangible results very quickly. It's a lot of like hypotheticals and big picture, but I'm the big picture on the team, so that's kind of my job.
That makes sense to me. So especially with a 20-year-old business, it always seems from the outside that things came quickly and easily and simply. But we all know, I mean, that whole overnight bullshit, we all know it's dead and dying. Like there's nothing like an overnight success. But I want to know what challenges or unexpected challenges you guys have faced that people wouldn't know about. Like the things that were difficult that no one expects.
I think one of the biggest challenges, and ultimately ended up being one of our biggest rewards, was really spending time coming up with an operational model, like an organizational operations process internally. And it was that transition from scrappy reactionary company to preserving that culture, but being intentional about how we work, that transition. I've been thinking about that a lot because when I kind of set off on this journey to figure this out, there wasn't a lot in our space. If you weren't looking at these like super fast growing startups, which you almost can't apply apples to apples to a company like ours because we're not growing from 20 to 60 in 1 year, right? Like there's operational challenges and ways in which they build that is just going to be radically different from ours. But I spent a lot of time with non-tech entrepreneurs, and that's business 101, right? How do you organize? What's your structure look like? How do you plan? What's your cadence of meetings? All these things. And so it's very dirty. It's not sexy. It's like, it's not product. It's not innovation. It's really just sitting down and saying, all right, well, how often do we meet? How often do we plan? What does our planning look like? What does that document look like that we want to present? And the more I got into it, companies that are way ahead of us, 150, 200, 1,000 people, like they have these beautiful operating systems because they know that it's the only way you can function really well is to have clarity on structure, how we plan, how we work. We had nothing like that, and that work was just I was just talking with my team, like, we should share what we've done because we have this whole Wild Bit Way document and like how we plan and how we structure, because maybe it'll help other people ask themselves some interesting questions.
Yeah.
But it was transformative to us because we went from having kind of a lot of thrashing and chaos, and one team's in strategic thinking and the other one's in execution and the other one's about to ship, and there's a marketing campaign here and there, and everybody's just like all over the place, and internal documentation is insane and people are trying to keep up. It was chaotic, and we've created a lot of consistency across teams and a cadence that's feels a little bit slower or a little bit more longer term, but is so much more effective in the long run. Where I think we were under that in that camp where like you want to move quickly and iterate, and change course as often as you need to, and react as quickly as you want, 2-week iterations, 4-week iterations, whatever. We plan in quarters, which I think, and some people are like, that's crazy. And I'm like, it's crazy to change direction more frequently than every 3 months, and we plan in a year, and then we break that year into quarters, and we'll adjust, we'll change course, but we really try to stay rooted in like our longer term vision and not be crazy reactionary based on what happens, with a competitor in the market. I mean, we react, but we try not to be like totally ripping things apart. What that's done for us is we've made some massive strides in big strategic projects that we would have never done because we would have been reacting in these short iterations of 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it is, and not chasing a bigger goal. But that work is not sexy. I mean, it's like nobody gets excited about it. People are like, what is Natalie working on? And I'm like, you guys, I'm so excited. I'm like writing 1,000 documents and I'm thinking this stuff through, and I'm creating templates and in Google Docs. And they're like, Natalie, that's a table. I'm like, yeah, so cool. And you fill a box in here and then this happens, and I color coded, and they're like, you have lost your mind. But it worked. I mean, it was so important. And the team's like, oh, things are calm and we're actually moving forward on these big projects. And it's still work, right? It's always a practice. We're still getting better at it, but it was huge for us. Sure. And something that I rarely hear people talk about.
And it is such a key observation for me because startups get tricked into thinking that this is how startups will be forever. There will be panic, there will be stress, there will be anxiety, you will always be reactionary, when actually, if you get it right in day one, the rest of it, that's the way it is. So yeah, I love that. I think that's such a great perspective for anyone listening. Like, just, it's okay to be okay. It's okay to have a startup that doesn't rip your life.
No, it's better. It's not okay, it's better. I mean, I think ultimately,
it's the optimal.
How did you do 20 years? And I'm like, well, because I don't hate my job. I don't hate the business. I don't hate my team. My life is really good. Very early on, I think I was pregnant with our first daughter. So 11 years ago, we had an acquisition conversation. It was like early on, and it was somebody we knew, like a company that we were close with, and they were like, we want to talk. And we said, okay, fine, let's have a conversation. I don't really have a lot of those, but every once in a while, you're like, let's see where this, what you're asking. And they asked this question, and I will never forget this because they're sitting in this meeting and they're talking about all kinds of stuff. And at one point they go, they're like biz dev guy, right? Like the one that's like trying to clinch this deal. And he goes, you guys must be so exhausted. And Chris and I were like, no, we're great. We're like loving life. And like, we walked out of that meeting, and I remember, and I was like, oh, I don't think that was the answer they were hoping for, right? They were hoping because the concept is that,
you were
struggling, you're so stressed, you're not paying. There's a whole, I talk a lot about people, founders paying themselves, but that you're not paying yourself. Chris and I have always paid ourselves, always. And have always given ourselves raises when the business does better.
It's not a business if the founders don't get
paid. But a lot of them don't. And so it is, you're exhausted, you're not getting paid for your work, your life isn't changing, your family's life isn't changing. And so somebody comes around and says, hey, I'll give you, bottom dollar, but I'll take it from you. And you're like, yes, please take it. And we were never like that.
Yeah, I love that. So what one thing has happened to you that you would never want to repeat, but you're grateful did happen?
I don't know if it's a recency bias, but we had this product we worked on, Conveyor, and we worked on it for 5 years and then ended up just shutting it down. Spent like $3 million on it and just turned it off. And
pre-launch, you turned it off?
We launched it just couldn't move it. Like couldn't get people to convert. It was a hard product, and we bit off a lot more than we could chew. And that's a whole 4-hour conversation around all the things that we learned. But I think what I learned as a person is I have this issue where I'm a huge optimist. Like that's the space that I like to spend time in. But I'm also very resistant to negative feelings. And I think when you combine those two things together, you have a tendency to deny reality. And it's not a great place to be when you're leading a team and building a business. And Conveyor is definitely one of those examples where I feel like on a very personal level, I failed to acknowledge reality as a self-preservation, kind of technique, or to really just not be sad or to not feel bad, not even sad, bad. And I think I don't want to make that mistake again, but I'm very grateful for having the ability to reflect on it and realize, like, here's a very tangible way in which that really did not serve me. Where I think, like, over my lifetime, it's small areas here and there where, like, oh, I expect, I don't realize that things are the way they are, and I might get screwed every once in a while. Fine. But here's a big loss where it's not the only, there's 1,000 reasons, right? There's like all kinds of things, but that is maybe one of the core reasons and why I didn't stop it sooner, because I just wasn't able to sit in that long enough, like to sit in the feeling of those bad feelings of like, we screwed us up, or it's time to call it a day. It's time to deal with the repercussions on the beta test customers that we had hundreds of, and the team who's been working on it forever. And, there's just like a lot of difficult things that needed to happen. It ultimately happened, right? Like ultimately I was like, guys, we're done here. And we're done here because you're unhappy, and Wildbit is a place that does not do that. Like, it's everything around, the people. And if the people building the product aren't enjoying their work anymore, it's not worth it anymore. But I probably could have reached that conclusion way sooner if I had just had the introspection that I'm avoiding reality. I'm not purely an optimist. I'm also an optimist who doesn't like to be sad. So, like, you almost need some of those gut checks, and we just didn't have them. And I felt for a long time, and I still believe this, that, we can set goals and set direction, but we have to have some fluidness to it, some flexibility for it, because we don't know what we don't know yet, right? So as we kind of walk this journey, right, and especially in new product development, we had a sense of an audience and a sense of a problem we're trying to solve. And as we're working through that, we're like, actually, maybe it shifts a little bit to the right, and it's this audience and this problem, right? So I want to give ourselves space for that, but it took too long, right? Like, we should have known sooner that, like, we keep shifting that a little bit left and right, and it's just still not landing where it should. And this isn't good. And it's time to kind of call it. And we just didn't do that.
Yeah, in line with your earlier statement about not taking advice from people and listening to their experiences, I think that was an absolute gold nugget. I learned just listening to that. So my last question is, and I can guess what your trend of answer will be, is what do you wish someone told you when you were just starting out?
Oh, so many things. I wish somebody told us that it's better to not go at it alone. I think a lot of what I've learned, or a lot of, like, there's a lot of things that I wish I had learned, but they really came from having access to people, to not going at it alone. So, like, that's the core of it. And I think where Chris and I, because we had each other, we didn't feel lonely in the journey. And I met a lot of entrepreneurs who feel very lonely because they don't have anybody. And so they seek out a community, or a group, or founders, or a tribe, whatever you want to call it, much sooner in their journey, because they're alone completely, right? They have nobody to reach out to, nobody to commiserate with. Chris and I have never been alone in this. And so we are also very opposite minds. And so I think we just always had each other to complain to find out, to find support in, to riff off of ideas, to research all these things. And so for a long time, we just felt like that was enough. And in hindsight, had we not been really proud of the fact that, like, look at us, nobody knows who we are. We're building these products that everybody's using, but like they don't even know that Chris and Natalie exist, and they don't know the Wild Bit exists, and that's so cool. We're so cool for like keeping it, keeping so under the radar. I wish I had I had realized that sooner and reached out, because there are so many moments, like the operating system, right? Like products. Early on in the conveyor journey, I had a great founder friend who I trust, look at the product, and he goes, Natalie, this is too much. And I was like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, so it's not going to completely change direction, but he was 100% right. But so having those folks to talk to and connect with, I think we would have ended up here sooner. Like we would have had Wildbit's next 10 years, like this journey that we're on, is a direct result of having a 3 or 4 hour meeting with a person I really admire, Jason Cohen from WP Engine. And he said one thing to us in a long conversation, and it completely changed the entire course of the business. And it's like, those are the kind of moments where like Chris and I wouldn't have been able to say those things to ourselves. And I wish I had somebody who said, hey, go find other folks that do this too. Go find other folks who are dealing with these issues.
Yeah, Brenda. Absolutely. A friend of mine, Howard Mann, likes to say you can't read the label from inside the bottle. Just find people to read the label for you.
Great.
Like, that's so valuable. So that's it for me. Thank you so much. Please tell my listeners and viewers where they can find you, where they can follow you, where they can buy from you. The floor is yours.
I am just Natalie Nagele on Twitter. Tweet all kinds of random perspectives on business, but actually wildbit.com just relaunched our new brand, and there is a tremendous amount of startup kind of building a business in a meaningful way content that's behind the scenes, that's coming out with our perspective from a lot of founders that I'm friends with that have generously shared their journey. So signing up to that email list, I think, is extremely valuable if you're launching, but in particular if you care deeply about running a business, prioritizing people first.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure my listeners will go and sign up. I will for certain.
Thanks. This was so fun.